Welcome to your deep dive. Today we're tackling critical thinking, and I think you'll find it incredibly relevant in our digital world.
I see you've provided quite a mix of materials.
Yeah, we've got a critical thinking workbook, some historical analysis, even case studies on fake news.
Sounds like you're really trying to cut through all the noise out there.
Exactly. I want to make sense of this constant flow of information.
Well, you came to the right place.
So one thing that really stood out to me from the workbook was this story about Socrates.
Oh, yeah.
He guided this slave boy with no education to solve a math problem just by asking them the right questions.
Interesting.
It really got me thinking about how reasoning and critical thinking are like these fundamental skills.
Sees we all have.
Yeah, just waiting to be sharpened. And the workbook starts with this thought experiment, about changing a light bulb.
Okay.
But it's way too high to reach.
I've been there.
So it gets you thinking about different solutions, like using a stool or a ladder.
Or maybe calling that one really tall friend we all have.
Exactly. And that's like critical thinking in action, right?
It is. You assess the situation, you consider your options, and then you choose the best solution.
But in the digital age, it seems like those light bulb problems are, I don't know, hidden.
Hidden beneath layers of information, opinions, and sometimes just straight up misinformation.
So it's not just about finding the solution.
It's about figuring out what information you can actually trust.
Like separating fact from fiction, which is harder than ever these days.
Absolutely.
And the workbook actually defines critical thinking as the ability to carefully consider information to make informed decisions.
That informed part is key.
Yeah, because thinking carefully, it's more than just taking information in, right?
Right. It's about analyzing what you're seeing, understanding different viewpoints.
And then applying that knowledge to solve problems effectively.
Exactly.
So taking a step back before jumping to conclusions, the workbook calls this reflective thinking.
Which is so crucial, especially with how fast information comes at us online.
It's like we need to hit pause more often.
Dewey, the philosopher who championed this idea, argued that taking the time to analyze a situation, before reacting, it leads to better choices.
Makes sense.
It's about avoiding those impulsive reactions and really thinking through the consequences.
Like if you see a shocking headline online, a reflective thinker would pause.
And consider the source, look for other reports, and then form an opinion.
Much more level-headed.
Exactly.
So how do we actually train ourselves to be more reflective? Because the workbook also mentions all these sub-skills.
Like analysis, interpretation,
Infinite-
inference.
Evaluation, even self-regulation. It seems like a lot.
Think of them as tools in your critical thinking toolkit.
I like that.
You might not need of every tool for every situation.
But having a variety makes you a more versatile thinker.
Precisely.
Speaking of skill sets, the workbook keeps mentioning this mutilated chessboard problem.
Yes.
Do you think that's connected to those sub-skills?
Definitely. It illustrates how analysis and inference can lead to surprising conclusions.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
But before we jump into that, let's lay the foundation.
Okay.
We need to talk about reasoning and argumentation.
All right, let's do it.
Understanding how arguments are structured can help you identify flaws, avoid being swayed by misleading information.
Sounds essential, especially these days.
It is, and it's not as complicated as it sounds.
I hope so.
We'll break it down in a way that's easy to understand and apply to real-life situations.
I'm all ears. Okay, reasoning and argumentation. It sounds a bit academic.
It might sound that way, but it's really about understanding how to think critically.
So we can, win all those online arguments.
Well, not necessarily about winning, but more about...
Not getting fooled.
Exactly. It's about recognizing strong arguments,
Yeah.
even if they're not your own.
And spotting the weak ones.
And the workbook actually breaks it down really well.
How so?
Well, it starts by defining an argument, which basically has two main parts.
Okay.
Assertions, which are statements, like the earth is round. And then the arguments themselves, which use reasoning to support a conclusion.
So, the Earth is round because ships disappear hull first over the horizon.
Exactly. That reasoning is what makes it an argument.
So it's not just stating a belief.
Right. It's about providing evidence or logic to back it up.
I get it. But then the workbook also mentions non-arguments, which is a bit confusing.
Yeah, it can be a bit tricky.
Because is that just a fancy way of saying bad argument?
Not always. A non-argument might sound persuasive.
But it's lacking something.
It lacks that logical structure. It might appeal to emotions or use irrelevant examples or rely on beliefs that are just unfounded.
Okay, so video games are bad because they make kids lazy.
Exactly. That's a viewpoint.
but it doesn't really offer any evidence.
Right, it's just an opinion, not a well-structured argument.
Gotcha. Now, the workbook also talks about this idea of logical validity versus truth,
Ah,
which seems a bit mind-bending.
it can be, but think of it this way. An argument can be logically structured, meaning the conclusion follows from the premises,
Premises.
the statements that the argument is based on,
Okay.
but those premises themselves might be false.
So it's like a house built on sand.
Exactly. The structure might look good, but the foundation is weak.
And the workbook used the example of the Dreyfus affair
Right, where a French officer was wrongly convicted of treason.
because they used forged documents as evidence?
And the arguments against him were logical, but they were built on lies.
Wow. So even if an argument sounds convincing, we have to be careful about the information it's based on.
Especially today, with all the misinformation online.
It's like people can package lies in a neat, logical box, and suddenly they seem credible.
Precisely. And this is where those critical thinking skills become so crucial.
You need to be able to analyze that underlying information, right?
Exactly. Evaluate the sources, consider potential biases.
Before you accept any conclusion.
Even if it's presented logically.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. So how do we actually get better at, like, dissecting arguments?
Well, the workbook talks about different types of reasoning.
Like deductive and inductive.
Exactly.
What's the difference?
Deductive reasoning starts with a general principle and applies it to a specific case.
Okay.
It's like saying, all dogs are mammals, Fido is a dog, therefore Fido is a mammal.
Makes sense.
If those initial statements are true, then the conclusion must also be true.
That seems pretty straightforward.
It can be, but what if those initial statements, those premises, are wrong?
Ah, good point.
The workbook gives this funny example. All actors are robots. Brad Pitt is an actor. Therefore, Brad Pitt is a robot.
Well, logically it makes sense, but obviously the starting point is flawed.
Exactly. And that's why analyzing those premises is so important.
So deductive reasoning can be powerful, but only if you have accurate information to begin with.
If the foundation is shaky, the whole argument crumbles.
So even with deductive reasoning, critical thinking is still essential. Okay, what about inductive reasoning? How's that different?
Inductive reasoning works in reverse.
Reverse.
It starts with specific observations and uses them to form general conclusions.
Okay.
It's like noticing that every time you eat a certain food, you get a stomachache.
And then you conclude that you're probably allergic to it.
Exactly. You're noticing patterns and making an educated guess based on those patterns.
Scientists use that all the time, right?
They do. They observe data from experiments and use it to form hypotheses.
But with inductive reasoning, there's always a chance you could be wrong.
There is. Even if your observations are solid, there might be other factors at play.
So it's not about finding absolute truth.
It's about making the most reasonable conclusion based on the evidence you have.
What the workbook calls plausible inference.
Exactly.
And this is where critical thinking helps us avoid jumping to conclusions,
Especially when we only have limited information.
which is often the case online.
Right. And that's why the workbook stresses the importance of seeking out different perspectives,
Considering alternative explanations.
and being willing to change your mind as new information comes to light.
So it's like inductive reasoning is about being okay with uncertainty.
To a certain extent, yes.
Knowing that we might not have the whole picture.
But constantly evaluating and refining our understanding as we go.
Gotcha. So we've covered reasoning, both deductive and inductive.
And how critical thinking plays a role in both.
But the workbook also dives into rhetoric, which seems less about logic and more about persuasion.
Think of rhetoric as the art of using language effectively to persuade your audience.
Okay.
It can be used for good or bad,
So a skilled speaker can use rhetoric to make a compelling argument.
but it can also be used to manipulate or mislead.
Kind of like Lucy in those Peanuts comic strips.
Exactly. She was a master of rhetoric, even if her arguments were often, well,
A little suspect.
let's just say she had her own unique style of persuasion,
But the workbook breaks down these different rhetorical techniques,
like using buzzwords or jargon,
or even euphemisms and dysphemisms.
which are ways of using language to frame an issue in a positive or negative light.
So it's about being aware of how language is being used to influence us.
Whether it's in a political speech, an advertisement, or even just a casual conversation.
The workbook even had us analyze those everyday phrases,
Like think outside the
or
box
at the end of the day.
to see how language can subtly shape our thinking.
It was a good exercise.
It really helps build awareness.
And then beyond those specific techniques, there are the three fundamental persuasive appeals.
Pathos, ethos, and logos.
Remind me again what those are.
Pathos appeals to emotion, ethos to credibility, and logos to logic and reason.
So a politician might use pathos to stir up fear or anger,
Right.
ethos to build trust by highlighting their experience,
Exactly.
and logos to present statistics or data to support their claims.
Precisely. And understanding these appeals can help you analyze any persuasive message,
See through the smoke and mirrors.
Exactly. It's like having a decoder ring for understanding how people are trying to influence you.
That's a good way to put it. But even when we can spot those tactics, we still have to watch out for logical fallacies.
Ah, yes. The sneaky flaws in reasoning.
What the workbook calls the deceptive dozen,
We've all fallen for them at some point,
like the straw man
where you misrepresent your opponent's argument to make it easier to attack,
or the ad hominem
where you attack the person making the argument rather than the argument itself,
and the bandwagon effect.
where you argue that something must be true because lots of people believe it.
It's amazing how these fallacies pop up everywhere.
They do, from online comment sections to political debates.
But the workbook gives some great advice on how to counter them
Like if someone uses the straw man, you can calmly point out the distortion.
and redirect the conversation back to the actual issue.
It's all about staying calm, staying focused on the facts, and avoiding those emotional traps.
And sometimes the best way to win an argument is to just walk away.
Not every battle is worth fighting, especially online.
So true. It's easy to get sucked into those endless back and forths online.
But sometimes it's better to step back and save your energy.
Agreed. So we've covered reasoning, rhetoric, and fallacies.
A lot of ground covered.
I feel like I've leveled up my understanding of how information is presented and manipulated.
That's the goal.
But I'm really curious about how all of this applies to our digital lives.
Where we're constantly bombarded with information.
Exactly. And I know the workbook dives into that specifically.
It does.
So I'm ready to explore that next. Okay, so digital life. I don't know about you, but online shopping always gets me.
Oh, tell me about it.
I see those 5-star ratings and I'm like, sold. Even
You
though,
feel like it being manipulated.
yeah, but it's like my brain just automatically trusts the wisdom of the crowd.
Well, that's social proof for you.
Social proof.
Yeah, it's this psychological phenomena.
Oh,
We
yeah.
tend to conform to what others are doing or believing, especially online.
So it's like safety in numbers, but digital.
Exactly. Those star ratings, the number of likes, followers,
It creates this sense that if everyone else is doing it, it must be right,
which isn't always the case.
especially online, where things can go viral so quickly.
And the workbook actually connects this to the power of influencers.
Oh, right.
Because you see your favorite influencer raving about a product,
And suddenly you need it too.
even if you didn't even know it existed 5 minutes ago.
Social proof is powerful stuff.
It is. And critical thinking helps you recognize when you're being influenced by it.
So you can make decisions based on your own needs, not just what everyone else is doing.
Exactly.
Which brings us to, I think, the biggest challenge of critical thinking in the digital age.
Fake news.
The workbook actually starts this section with a really interesting story.
What's that?
The Great Moon Hoax from back in the 1830s.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
This newspaper published a series of articles claiming there was life on the moon.
Complete with bat-like humanoids and all sorts of crazy creatures.
And people totally believed it.
It was a complete fabrication, but it captured the public's imagination.
Shows how fake news is nothing new.
It's been around for centuries.
But what makes it so dangerous today? Is it just the speed at which it spreads online?
That's definitely part of it.
But it seems like there's more to it.
There is. Modern fake news is often designed to exploit our biases.
Play on our emotions. Yeah.
Exactly. It might look like a legitimate news article, but...
It's pushing a specific agenda.
Right. The workbook uses the example of the 2016 U.S. election
Where Russian agents spread misinformation on social media.
to try to influence the outcome.
So social media isn't just about sharing funny cat videos anymore,
It's become a powerful tool for spreading information, both true and false.
which is why critical thinking is more important than ever.
It's essential for navigating this complex landscape.
So what are some practical tips for spotting fake news?
First, always consider the source,
Is it a reputable news organization?
or some random website you've never heard of, and check the date of the article,
Because sometimes old news stories get recirculated.
as if they're current events. Also, pay attention to the author.
Do they have a known bias or agenda?
It's like being a detective.
Looking for clues to determine if a story is credible or not.
Exactly.
The workbook also says to be wary of emotionally charged language
Or headlines designed to provoke outrage or fear,
because it's easy to get swept up in those emotions.
and share something without really thinking it through.
So, slow down, take a breath.
Ask yourself, does this story even make sense?
Is it consistent with what I already know?
And don't be afraid to do a little research,
Check those fact-checking websites
like Snopes or factcheck.org.
to see if a story has already been debunked.
It's about being proactive.
Taking responsibility for the information we consume and share.
And remember, even reliable sources can make mistakes.
True?
So it's about applying a healthy dose of skepticism to everything you see online.
No matter how trustworthy it might seem at first glance.
Exactly.
I really like how the workbook frames all of this.
How so?
It says critical thinking isn't just a set of skills, it's a way of life.
A mindset.
And it emphasizes two key virtues, humility and patience.
Humility is key because it allows us to admit we don't know everything.
And be open to new information, even if it challenges our beliefs.
And patience reminds us that critical thinking is a process.
It takes time to consider different perspectives.
Weigh the evidence before forming a judgment.
And the workbook offers some really practical advice.
Like what?
Question your assumptions, seek out diverse viewpoints, and practice logic and reasoning in your everyday life.
It even suggests reading more critically.
Analyzing the author's arguments, identifying biases, and logical fallacies.
It's about making a conscious effort to engage your critical thinking skills.
In every aspect of your life.
It's like a muscle you need to exercise regularly.
And the workbook ends with this quote, "Thinking is the hardest work there is," which is probably the reason so few engage in it.
I love that quote.
It's so true. Critical thinking takes effort, but it's so worth it.
It really is.
It empowers you to make informed decisions, navigate a complex world.
And become a more discerning consumer of information.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive into critical thinking.
I want to leave you with this thought.
Okay.
In an age where information is both abundant and easily manipulated, critical thinking is no longer a luxury.
It's a necessity.
It's the key to understanding the world around us.
And making informed choices that shape our lives.
And our future.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and empowering.
And remember, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep refining your thinking.
Because the journey of critical thinking never really ends.